G'day, legends. I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a brilliant weekend and getting out and about a little bit. Now, yesterday in the beginning of the video, I told you that I was having my MRI scan, or at least the results back from that scan, and I'd share it with you today. I'll share it with you in a second. But today, what are we going to talk about? I want to talk about bots and influence on social media and how that can affect then the messaging coming out of the war. We're going to talk about more of that at length. I want to look at strike capability, long-range strikes, and the effectiveness of some of this actually heading into winter. And something I was thinking about last night of a weapon system of which has been having a lot of effect, but into winter may have even more effect. Then we need to look at the maps and some doctrine over what we are seeing on the maps and why some things are shifting and why some movements are happening of specific units. So look, let's start with me, my health, my update. Not terrible news, not fantastic news either. So my tumour has grown just a little bit, just under about 2 millimeters. Now, to give you an idea of what we're looking at, here is my brain. It is in there. Now, this is the tumour then here. It goes depth and across, but of course this is top looking down on the MRI, and it has been then grown just a little bit. Now, one of the concerns here is if we have a look on then the right side of my brain, then we see the gaps in this other then tissue of the brain, and you can see how it's adding a lot of pressure on the left side of my brain here. So that is an increased risk of things like seizure and other altercations as well. So the surgeon, she's not super concerned, but she said we need to be on more alert with how this is going. I'm in for another more high-end MRI called a functional MRI. I'm sure some will be familiar with what that is within the next, say, 2 to 3 weeks to maybe get more of an idea. They potentially may open me back up for another biopsy, as well as they want to see what from that functional MRI, if maybe there's some neuroplasticity and that has maybe opened up for an actual proper surgery removal, or if maybe more chemo is going to be on the horizon. But as always, we'll wait and see together and I'll let you know how we go. But if I just suddenly ever stop uploading, please just go back and watch some of my old videos, because that's the only inheritance that I'm going to be leaving. Now, I want to talk about bots and bot farms and influence overall as well, as I think this is something everyone knows exists, but I think everyone thinks only exists on one side. Now, a very interesting study came out of this. Now, this is back in 2022, actually from a local university to where I live, that bots manipulate public opinion, Russia, Ukraine in conflict. And we can see this here, that applied mathematics and statistics, these guys bloody geniuses, that public opinion can be manipulated on a very large scale, especially using automated generated bot accounts. As a result, these environments can be used to manipulate discussion as well as cause disruption and overall public distrust. So they looked at these hashtags of I stand with Putin, I stand with Russia, I support Russia, and also stand with Ukraine, stand with Zelensky, and support Ukraine. We found between 60 and 80% of tweets using these hashtags came from bot accounts during the first 2 weeks of the war. We noticed there were spikes in bot activity that associated with significant developments throughout the conflict. For example, when there was a spike in bot activity immediately after Putin captured the first major Ukrainian city, likely to bolster support for the move. And this is something that I have seen over parts of content too, is when that these bots are interacting and the change in effect they may have. The most obvious one I've seen recently on my stuff was actually this post when the F-16 pilot Alexei Mess was killed. If you go and look through any of my Telegram posts, I never ever have this many interactions. And you can see the massive amount of interactions that actually are caused with this post. And I see this across YouTube. I see channels with 10 times my viewers with less comments than myself. And this is the thing in sort of the online informational war, is for some reason your views and I guess your status in the public eye, that equals your credibility regardless of maybe qualifications of speaking about something. Like if Beyonce took a stance on this war, that would be reported more than if some lieutenant colonel from the army did as well. So that's but that's on a massive level, but you can see how online that can have such a huge effect. And I think so many bots are interacting on a lot of accounts without people knowing, including the uploader as well. I think one of the big ones you might see is actually liking comments, like a bot making a comment and then pushing that comment to push it to the top, because this can provoke some sort of herd mentality and a lot of confirmation bias. I think the best example of like herd mentality confirmation bias without further research is actually if you look on like stock market Reddit pages, the people will invest their actual money without doing any research because they'll listen to the mob. That confirmation bias, potentially even that could be swung by bots in this day and age, especially with massive bot farms operating then throughout the world, absolutely everywhere. And I noticed this most actually recently with Kursk and Pokrovsk. So when there was the push into Kursk, the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk, I noticed through my channel and my Telegram a lot more like very hardline pro-Ukrainian stuff pushing through. And when Pokrovsk started falling, I noticed a lot more real hardline pro-Kremlin, pro-Russia stuff putting through as well. And I guess I'm very lucky to have sort of an overview of a large sample size to look at, and I sort of get an idea where this might use. That said, I do actually hate the word bot because it's often used just to discredit someone who has a different opinion to yourself. But in this day and age with the AI and stuff, it's so hard to determine what is a bot and what isn't a bot. Now, with that Adelaide University study I showed you, I actually, at the time, a few years back now, I actually had a meeting and a coffee with the guys about this to do it. And if you actually want to watch my video specifically on this, I'll put it here. I'll chuck a link. If I can get this, I'll chuck a link as well in like the top pinned comment or somewhere in the description if you want to look, because I break down like the full study. They sent me across all the research on this as well. I actually wanted to do an interview with these guys because, you know, I'm not some bloody applied mathematics. I would like them to break down, but they did do an interview before mine, and just with how political this war is, after their first like public interview with someone else, it was like, we don't want to do that again, but we'll send you then the research. And that is a problem when politics seeps into just bloody information. This is applied mathematics, researching something, not taking then a stance. I've actually really thought about doing some experimentation and creating some truly like propaganda-y, X will win, Y will win, like propaganda videos on my channel to see how bots may interact with them differently. That said, I don't think I can do it because people won't understand if I'm actually just doing a test or not. So I think that is an interesting piece just to look at, and the bot activity that may increase and decrease as we see this shift, and how some voices, I believe, are getting greatly promoted to try and have like a more confirmation bias there, and specifically on where these websites are coming from, you know, where Telegram may have more like, say, pro-Russian bots, YouTube, whatever, may have more pro-Ukraine. Again, it's hard to exactly know, but it is interesting to look at some of the studies breaking this down as well. Now, the reason I talk about this is, of course, we see intelligence operations coming through from Kremlin-sponsored media companies through an intermediaries, then funding some of the US media and all people in that space as well. And I want to just say again, I don't think it is pushing on one side or the other. I purely think just causing division. That is what Russia and China want. And I know the one that got uncovered was $10 million. I'd say behind the scenes, there are billion-dollar operations to try and sow division in many areas of the world. Now, that is from past examples as well that we've seen that is what is being tried to be done. Now, like I said, I don't think they care about which side as long as it causes division. I think the thought process behind this is that the West would likely crumble inwardly rather than outward military influence on the West, that it would more likely go in than actually be taken over. And with my knowledge of the Western military absolute dominance around the world, both in logistics and industry and capability, because that is objectively true, there is such a dominance there, but within the military, within the West, there is a lot of incredible hostility towards maybe differing opinion, massively growing divided political landscape. And I don't disagree with this. I think there is a more likely chance there is a West collapse rather than ever a military takeover, if that makes sense. And that falls in line with where then outside bots may be pushing in. What we don't have much information on is how bots that we are going to be using, because we're not going to be using this, pushing on other nations as well. And one of my guys does a bit of writing for me, fantastic. I spoke about what I spoke about yesterday with the influence from Russia trying to push on Harris or Trump or whatever. He slightly disagrees with what I said, but I'll present this because that is super important. Also, I wanted to comment on the argument you've made about Trump and Russia's messaging regarding wokeness and traditional values. So what I spoke about was Trump pushes this sort of traditional values, conservatism. That is really where his support lies from his supporters and where a lot of his messaging is. And what I've said is Russia is trying to paint themselves as a conservative traditional values. We see with like the decree against neoliberalism and other messaging coming out of the Kremlin there of like, why would this side want that side in power if it sort of goes against what they say? But he disagrees here. I think these ideas have probably crossed a few minds in the Kremlin, but I think they are very much secondary to the war in Ukraine for a few reasons. First, the war is happening now is costing in a lot of material resources, human lives, and diplomatic capital. While the little values rivalry between the West and Russia, China is much more diffuse, less urgent, and mostly non-lethal. Second, the US is not defined by its president, and even if Trump were elected, it would not change the political leanings of the media, Hollywood, universities, pop stars, Silicon Valley, and everything else that makes up American influence throughout the world. If anything, it might radicalize some people to make them lean left even harder against Trump. You push back maybe then the other way. So that's where it goes against what I was saying. That is very interesting to look at, and I somewhat agree with this. Third, even if Trump somehow managed to limit all of this, he'd be serving in his second term, which means by January 2029, he'd be out, assuming he didn't die of old age before that. Realistically, what would this accomplish? Maybe just delay things for a bit. In the grand scheme of things, that's not a big deal at all. So, yeah, America overall is not defined by its president, but the painting out of Russia of what America is, how much influence does the president have on that? Because what I see is the messaging coming out of particularly the Kremlin. China's just so hush-hush on things, but particularly out is the West has lost their way, lost the conservative traditional values, and that America, it will collapse inwardly if things don't change. Why would they want Trump in power? That was my argument, I guess, there. That being said, I do agree that Trump is highly unpredictable, so that it's not at all obvious to me that Moscow would like to see him in power. After all, the Dems are in the White House right now, and Russia is winning. So they have the initiative on the East in the war and the industrial capability right now. Because what I said was, well, the Democratic leader, Harris, she's the vice president at the moment. What is actually going to change if she just steps up one rung on the ladder? Not really that much. Where Trump is highly unpredictable. We don't yet actually know where to 95% accuracy we can see what the Democratic policies will be, because we've seen it throughout the last 3 years in Ukraine from then Biden. So would they, being the Kremlin, want to risk it all on a Trump gamble? Perhaps not. And Trump has said if he couldn't get Russia to agree to a peace deal, he'd send Ukraine way more weapons. I don't know whether he means that or is bluffing, but perhaps Putin doesn't know either and doesn't particularly wish to find out. But then again, Putin must surely realise that by endorsing a candidate in the US election, he's not exactly helping them. We've seen Putin then say he'd rather Harris in power, but also was laughing at that. So perhaps he's endorsing Harris to get Trump elected, or to get people to believe that his intention is to motivate them to vote Harris in order to defeat that intent. Perhaps he's just having fun fucking with everyone. My point, if I have one, is really that it is extremely difficult to tell if Moscow has a favourite candidate, and I suspect it's more likely that they're interested in division rather than in any specific candidate. 100% agree with that. Forgot the most important part. Even if Russia really had a favourite candidate, realistically, what could they do to have a meaningful effect on the election? If it were easy, the Dems and Republicans would have done it themselves. So how much effect actually is here? And that's very hard to get a grasp on through those social media people shut down yesterday, that company. How much effect was that actually having? Funding, into political parties, into other areas. How much effect is that actually then occurring? And I'd love to be able to peel back the curtain and see where foreign money is going. Because if I was in charge of a country to try and have a massive effect on America, I'd be looking at, right, I want to find the most left thing I can find and the most right thing I can find to just cause that divide to divide. I wouldn't really care who's in charge of that. I just want to cause that divide. And I think the Russians and Chinese will see maybe even more of this. Now, I want to talk about strike capability and FABs too, but in two separate pieces in here. Now, firstly, just to have a bit of something funny, I saw this the other day and I can't get it out of my head. So this is the new foreign minister for Ukraine, Andriy Sybiha. This is, of course, the old one, Dmytro Kuleba. Someone said, have they just sacked Kuleba to employ his dad? And now it's stuck in my head and I can't not see it. You've got to admit there's a lot of similarity. But if he put on Kuleba's glasses, I'm telling you, it's his dad. So maybe I laughed when I saw that, but it'll be interesting to see how Andriy handles things very differently. Ukraine has a new aid package coming through from the US as far as new and I've put a mark at things that I think will make the most effect here. So Bradley's, RAM-7 missiles for air defense, Stinger missiles. I think that'll have a huge difference, at least near the front, and ammo for HIMARS valued at $250 million. We don't have very specifics of exactly how that is going. Now, I saw this post and I just want to give my 2 cents. So Fabian Hoffman, and this is a doctoral research fellow at Nuclear Oslo and Uni Oslo, Defence Policy, Missile Technology and Nuclear Strategy. So doctoral expert in this. He goes, why does Russia employ camouflage nets at known S-300 and 400 locations around Moscow? And the net does nothing. I'll give my 2 cents on this. Right, the net does obscure exactly what is there, meaning maybe at night, maybe whenever, you may be able to actually replace it with a decoy that's set up very similarly and not be super obvious. Now, I think more likely than that is actually to counter AI, so artificial intelligence machine targeting too. So to be looking for a specific S-300, 400 radar or launcher system. The net breaks up that shape, similar to the tires on board. Then you forget about a few things. Shade. People work at these systems, just having shade as well. That actually does really matter if you're at a soldier level, and that it may hide it more from view of civilians in the area for a psychological impact and threat as well. Now, one thing I have seen as well, and if you find anything on this, I don't, of course, have eyes everywhere, so please send it across. So we're seeing more footage of these fiber optic drones in use by the Russian forces, and this one actually flies within a building. Guys are sleeping, or Ukrainian soldiers here are sleeping, and it targets them. Now, these drones are working not off radio signal, but a direct fiber optic cable. So if you find anything on that, please just email it across or make it known to me. I'm very interested to see what that system actually is. But the only place we're seeing them used is actually in Kursk. I haven't seen them at least clearly used anywhere occupied. So what that may be telling me is Russia, because in Kursk, Russia using a weapon system, if it gets shot down or jammed or whatever, they probably have a much more higher chance of that weapon system being within Russian-controlled territory and therefore not being as recoverable for high-range, high-tech equipment to be maybe reverse engineered or analogs or see what exactly is in it. So we may see more of those higher-end units that they're not willing to risk over occupied or some occupied or on the border of Ukrainian territory either. So we may see that. And maybe that's why we're seeing it operate around Kursk as well. Be very interested in knowing more about that. And then I want to talk about winter and FABs. And this is something I was just thinking about last night. And I asked on my Telegram today, when did we start to see FAB glide bombs, and not just start seeing them entering the AO, but the use of them en masse and somewhat accurately. And the general consensus is, okay, we saw them pop up mid to late 23, but they really didn't start having a huge effect on the front line until Avdiivka. Of course, 2024 through this year, and Russia's primarily been on the offensive all year. Okay, and what I've thought about this, the reason this came up was, okay, we haven't really seen them used then throughout winter. It's been primarily this year. And in winter, ground movements by armour and troops really, really slows down and turns into more positional, localised artillery positional battles. And my concern with this is that the poor weather will slow and make manoeuvre warfare either very slow or impossible in some areas, and this poor weather will actually have very little effect on the glide weapons themselves. So in turn, If you have a more stagnant, dug-in front line, these weapons actually may be then actually more effective, which of course is a huge problem for the defensive works build up if you're not constantly on that maneuver element where these can't then hit. And air defense and defensive positions that are able to deal with either the impact of the weapon or the Su-34, actually dropping them, is not going to be the deciding factor in this. The defensive positions, if you're getting hit by 500 to 250 through to 3,000 kilogram bombs, of course I know the warhead's smaller than that, but no defensive position in the world can just hold that day after day, week after week after week if it's not moving. And the Su-34, as far as just defensive against them, we have seen it has not been that effective. That's why Ukraine needs to strike deeper into Russia, or needs the capability to strike deeper into Russia at the bases where these aircraft are, which of course then creates a whole other issue because of the long-range strike capability that Ukraine doesn't have with ballistic or cruise missiles. It does have with drones, but then there's a speed issue. The air-to-air refueling capability of the Su-34, and remember the Su-34 still has a range of 4,000 kilometers, so it still has a very large planning range as well. And this needs to come into these accounts of what is going to happen to actually try and hit these bases. And we need to look at this to do with long-range strike capability and what Zelensky has said as well. In the Ramstein meetings, we'll talk about bombers and the amount, and what Lloyd Austin has said as well. And so at the end of Zelensky's speech there, the third point, long-range capability. Thanks for your joint coverage. We've implemented very important operations, in particular in Crimea. These operations allowed us to return security to the Black Sea and food exports. Now we hear that your long-range policy has not changed, but we see changes in the ATACMS, Storm Shadows and Scalps, a shortage of missiles and cooperation. So the policy has not changed, but what they're seeing, the Ukrainians are seeing, are changes in these being delivered and the cooperation. And this applies to our territory. So not only is this happening, no policy change into Russian territory, Zelensky's saying here it's applying even in occupied areas too, which is occupied by Russia, including in Crimea. We haven't seen these Storm Shadow scalp strikes for a while anywhere, really. We think it's wrong that there are such steps. We need to have this long-range capability, not only on the occupied territory of Ukraine, but also on Russian territory, so that Russia is motivated to seek peace. So this is interesting that there's problems even on the Russian occupied territory instead of Ukraine investments. We're ready to produce more of our own weapons right here in Ukraine. We're ready to work with you on joint production. This includes drones, missiles, and other weapons. To achieve this, we need funding. We're ready to quickly produce everything that will help us bring this war to an end, namely putting decisive pressure on Russia for real peace. And I think this is going to have to be the way ahead here is, my spelling's off here, but is domestically produced weapon systems for that long-range strike. It doesn't look like America's going to budge. Even if they do budge on the ATACMS, on the Storm Shadow Scalp coming from France or the UK, the range of these still aren't enough. We know the US has said 90% of those aircraft have already moved outside of that 300 Ks of the ATACMS. It's not going to have a lot. Zelensky talking then about further funding into Ukraine to produce not only for Ukraine, but to produce outwardly as well. I personally know some people who are in Ukraine looking for business ventures as well, because Ukraine is significantly cheaper to produce items, goods, wages, labour, significantly cheaper there than the majority of other Western allied countries too. So there is a lot of business opportunity that people are looking into Ukraine as well. I know there are a lot of investors buying up land, buying up apartments because it is cheap. There's going to be billions to trillions of dollars of money fuel into Ukraine over the next decades as well. A lot of business ventures, but for building things like weapon systems, where labour cost is very, very high in somewhere like Australia, the US, UK, France, Germany, that they're looking into Ukraine going, okay, it might be a lot cheaper to develop this here. And Ukraine, of course, are all on board with that because domestically produced weapon system may be able to use much, much longer range as well. So let's have a look at what Lloyd Austin has said here. Of course, SecDef, but we hear your urgency and we share it. You can read this all in the White House if you want. We'll push even harder to step up our support for Ukraine. We're meeting at a dynamic moment. Ukraine continues to seize the initiative on the battlefield. I would disagree with that, at least in the east and the south, maybe in Kursk. Ukraine troops are conducting an operation in Russia's Kursk region. The Kremlin's army of aggression is now on the defensive on its own turf. We know Putin's malice runs deep. Moscow continues its offensive in the east of Ukraine, especially around Pokrovsk, that continual grind and push. He does say more than 350,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded since Putin launched his all-out invasion. This is an interesting number that we see thrown around as well, because the numbers on this vary massively. Ukrainians' official numbers today by liquidated KIA are 622,000, and where people then extrapolating as well of 620,000, that means there's at least 1.8, 1.9 million who have been wounded. To see where this number grows out massively, where this number more tells me 110 maybe thousand have been killed, and that this is the total number in wounded as well. See the difference in here, and that, of course, this is not having those numbers is so hard for us to get this idea of Russia's ability to replenish its forces and absorb losses as well. He also says, additionally, Ukraine has destroyed 97 Russian combat aircraft since the start of Putin's full-scale invasion. So this is a lot of aircraft, but we need to see how many Russia actually has, and it is almost impossible to know how many Russian aircraft are both serviceable and unserviceable as well, or in reserve. Flight Global says there's almost 4,000 in 2015. That said, with any aircraft, knowing from my friends that work in the Air Force, they always say cut it in half for aircraft that can actually get up off the ground in that day. Most Ministry of Defence said that they, in 2023, 100 new and repaired aircraft and 150 helicopters. Again, as you know, if you follow me, I don't believe any Ministry of Defence numbers, especially if it's coming out for the Russian Air Force. Like when we see a new batch of planes, sometimes we'll only see a photograph of two. But let's have a look at some other sort of just online sources around these. Now, this, compared to other figures, seem very, very conservative here. But even Su-34s, 127 Su-24s at 200, and then we see down to your Su-57, your multi-role sort of claimed 5th gen, down at 10. Now, the reason I bring up like that drone only being used in Russian territory at the moment, we may only say something like the Su-57 only ever used on that territory, because if it goes down, the risk of it falling into Ukrainian territory and whatever technology on that they don't want getting leaked out as well. But again, at 10, the risk of one of those going down, you lose a massive amount straight off the bat. But as far as your Tu-22 long-range bombers, estimated 30 to 50 still in service. So again, it's very, very difficult to know. But what I'm pointing at is it's not like Russia's going to run out of aircraft in the near future. And Kyiv Independent, here, this is from them, combat aircraft production is annually 20 to 30. Russia's claiming somewhere from 100 to 120. Again, we don't know. I say that they're not published. Precise statistics aren't, but they have claims. Like Russia has claims how many. Russia's aircraft production does not remotely cover its losses. What I'd say in this is Lloyd Austin in this one has said 97. Ukraine here is saying 20 to 30. Actually, in the third year of the war, it's actually fairly close then to actually covering its losses for the Air Force there. And we have seen, in my opinion, the Russian Air Force actually working significantly better from its massive failure in the beginning. And you've probably heard me say on this channel, I think the element of the Russian forces that performed the worst compared to how we thought it would is 100% the Air Force. The level in difference between capability, material capability between Russia and Ukraine in the beginning of this war, we thought Russia would gain air superiority very, very quickly. Now, I know that the Russian VKS has a lot of localized air superiority, is more how some of their tactics work, but overall, the leaders there would be very disappointed, I think, with the performance of the Air Force, at least in the beginning. But in my opinion, it actually has shifted to being more capable as this has gone on. And the amount of aircraft lost versus being made, it's not like these lines are going to meet in the next 6 months and out of aircraft at all. Replacement rate may not be being met, but if it's only not being met by 10, 15, 20, 30%, there's still a hell of a lot of material still sitting there, if that makes sense. Ukraine must continue to boost its own defence production. Denmark committed 115 million security assistance package to buying arms from Ukraine's defence industry. Again, investing in domestic stuff. The US is working with Ukraine to design and rebuild a substitute for the S-300 surface-air missile with the R-27 air-to-air missile. Again, US-funded or West-funded weapons, Ukrainian weapons, to then be used within Russia as well. I think that's probably where we'll see a lot of this go if the US is not going to budge on this. The US has allocated more than $200 million to purchase critical components to let Ukraine produce more UAVs and electronic warfare systems. Now, I have a few friends that work in the drone space. One of the biggest problems with the sanctions against China and drone industry to try and impact Russia is that impacts us directly too, to give Ukraine the components for these drones, or Ukraine to purchase the components for the drones themselves. It's actually having a bit of a negative effect here too that may actually be affecting this side, like the Ukrainian side, significantly more than actually the Russian side for those drone components as well. And for these small consumer drones, China has an absolute stranglehold on that entire market. Austin says no weapon alone can decide the outcome of the war. And speaking of, there is no capability that's decisive in this campaign. We have discussion about tanks and other capabilities. Tom point out it's not just one thing, it's a combination of capabilities. Then, as for authorizing the use of ATACMS for deep strikes on Russian territory, he believes Ukraine has its own weapons for this purpose. And I've said again, I actually think that the Ukrainian developed domestically long-range drones that we've seen have success, well 1,000, 1,500 Ks into Russia. If Ukraine's not going to budge on that, that's probably the way to go ahead. Maybe even anyway, if you can have these new jet drones we're seeing working in large swarms to overwhelm their air defense, but they're more significantly cheaper than missiles. If America's not willing to give those missiles, may actually be the better way forward anyway. Ukraine has significant capabilities of its own to attack targets beyond the capability of ATACMS and Storm Shadow. Even if these, like we said, even if these gets lifted, it's 300 and 500 Ks. The TU aircraft are well outside that range. Other aircraft are well outside that range. Su-34 has 4,000 Ks of range. Again, can sit further and further back. I know this has other effects on wear and tear on the aircraft and fuel and the ability to get on target, all of this. But still, I think that the drones in large swarms, the success we've already seen, maybe keep pushing on that. And because of this, Ukraine cannot destroy carriers of the guided bombs that attack its cities. So TU's Su aircraft. And that's where into winter, I think, and this is a long way around of saying, I think into winter, the devastation of especially the Su-34 may actually increase more. It doesn't look like Ukraine will be getting the capabilities to destroy them on the airfield by then. And if the front line goes slower and more stagnant, that is going to increase the devastation of those 250, 500, 3,000, 1,500, 3,000 kilo FABs even more. But this is a Ukrainian Su-24M, a Soviet-produced fighter here, and under its wing is an analog of a sort of glide munition as well that's being developed. You can just see it here as well. I don't have much information on this yet, but I'll get as much as I can as we go. So let's then have a look at the maps and see where things are changing. So here's Ukraine, the center. Here's the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 2022. The purple since 2014. The green and blue is areas where Ukraine has had offensive actions and has pushed back the Russians. All the Russians may have withdrawn out of, in some cases too, except for in Kursk, that is a Ukrainian occupation back into Russian territory to take part in Zelensky's exchange fund. So where shall we look first? I don't have this really that sorted out by name. Let's go into the north and have a look here. Now, this map, Deep State, doesn't show any changes here, but we go into the Noel reports, who is being the most reliable up here. We can see this road to Ligov, that Ukraine has had 2 advancements today in here around this road, and he also states that this territory that just sits in here is likely under Ukrainian control as well at the moment, but not enough to confirm that. And this is moved by then where the Russian strikes are taking place too. So if Russian strikes are on Ukrainian positions, well, we can assume the map is then sitting up in here. So let's then have a look at some other areas as well. Now, we'll come back down onto the Deep State map. We'll see where some things are changing. Now, interestingly, Vovchansk in here shows that Russia made some ground in here and that there was green, so not new territory, more of a map correction here, where Ukraine's line actually is, because it would be blue if it was in 2 weeks of an advancement on this map. Now, I believe, personally, I don't think this is either a new Ukrainian or a new Russian advancement. I don't believe in that either. Syriac's maps for, I want to say, at least 6 to 8 weeks ago in here showed a further easterly push by Russia in here than this map ever showed. And recent maps have shown Ukraine further into Vovchansk. So I don't think this is new for the day. I could be wrong on that. I think it's more of a map correction at this point in time. So let's come down into then the Pokrovsk front. So we can see two movements here at Ukrainsk and Krasnoyarivka. Of course, we can see an increase in grey zone 2 around here, as there are reports that Ukraine is stepping back out of this Nevelsky Krasnoyarivka front. Also reports of failed Russian assaults into Luhansk. So what they're trying to do is trying to more bypass this and maybe get Ukraine to pull out and have an attack maybe from south heading north as well, rather than the failed break-in into here. So that's interesting, but we still do see movement into here. This map doesn't show the amount of Ukrainian offensive action we know was successful yesterday, because it never showed the Russians into Selidove, so it can't really show the back push that we knew actually 100% happened in here either. Now, I don't have actually any other maps to show you in here, but what I want to talk about is sector crisis. So there's this war at the moment, in my opinion, is a war of attrition, positional, protracted warfare, battles that is occurring with elements of maneuver, but that maneuver seems to fizzle very, very quickly. So this is what I believe the Russians are trying to do, and I'll show you something else in a sec. The intent is to remain inside the layer bubble of friendly protective systems while stretching depleted enemy reserves until the front collapses. There's a cascading effect in which a crisis in one sector forces defenders to shift reserve from another sector, only to generate a crisis there in turn, as forces are falling back and leaving prepared fortifications, morale plummets. So what we have seen is elements from Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, have moved around to Pokrovsk. We have seen offensive actions, successful offensive actions then occur in areas like Selidove, but we have seen then Russia have successful offensive actions where those troops have moved from, pushing on many areas of the front to create a crisis there because you're forced to fix a crisis somewhere else. Again, you're trying to plug holes in. If you've got a ship leaking and you've got 10 holes, you're trying to plug one, but you need to plug the 11th hole, this one's going to leak out. I believe that that's what Russia's trying to do in the attritional, is overwhelm their enemy in multiple areas of the front at once. And although they might be able to stabilize it in some areas, as soon as they stabilize it, the troops that are forced away creates then a crisis in here. And this is more of what Ukraine is trying to do on some doctrine here. That professional pre-war forces form the high end of the army, forming fire brigades. They move sector to sector in battle to stabilise the situation and conduct decisive attacks. Low formations hold the line and gain experience, slowly increasing their qualities until they gain capability on conduct offensive actions. Victory is acquired by creating the highest quality low-end formations possible. And what we have seen very recently is 9-3 Mech has stabilised the situation in Pokrovsk. Well, we've seen some attacks there. I wouldn't call it stable. We've seen them move down and conduct some offensive attacks there. 3rd Assault Brigade, they're the ones that did then New York. So there's higher end units. They're moving sector to sector to move in the situations here too. But the problem is, if we draw these both together, well, what it's doing then, but it's creating a crisis in the other area. And I think this boils down to the manpower shortage that Ukraine is having on the whole front line here and trying to develop that low quality formation. And Suryak, in his write-up, somewhat agrees with this. Saying on the front in Selidove, although these events have brought joy and misfortune to many, they should be analysed with a global view of the whole front. The arrival of Ukrainian reinforcements in Ugleda and Kupiansk, experienced troops were able to drive out the Russian troops barely entrenched in the outskirts of Selidove. In fact, Ukrainian resistance has increased considerably, not only here, but in the neighbourhood of Krasnoyarivka, which has slowed the continuing Russian advance in Pokrovsk. However, the success was meant for the Ukrainian side at serious cost by losing the north strategic Sinkivka, which will allow the approaching to Kupiansk, located in the lower terrain. Southern locality here, lost in June 22, will allow advancing into these areas and Ugleda. This shows that the Ukrainian army suffers important issues maintaining the wide front, having to assign experienced troops to other places while the Russian army takes advantage of these movements and press again positions on the disengaged axis. The Ukrainian situation is hairy and the decisions to be taken no longer to recover ground, but to stop the Russian advance are more and more costly. So again, moving in that the troops that have to come out of Sinkivka to stabilize maybe somewhere like New York, Donetsk, or the ones that come out of Bakhmut to then stabilise here, creates a problem there. And I believe that's what Russia's trying to do, is pressure everywhere to try and cause other issues, while Ukraine has its more professional elements trying to stabilise those and what will sort of give first. And we can't see on this map, but Suryak does show that there was more ground made in Sinkivka up around here as well. And of course, we have seen this front only yesterday. We can see some movement, of course, around the Berestovia. At least it's all in the same sort of Kupiansk front line then area. Now, talking about Pokrovsk, we need to have a quick look while we're here as well, but in another sector. So this is Pokrovsk, this is the front line. Now, what we can see, well, the zero line is, wrong map completely. This footage has come out of a bridge destroyed in here, and the geolocation for this bridge that I have found is right in here. So, of course, it is this bridge right here that Russia has taken down to try and limit the logistics supply into Pokrovsk and into other areas on this eastern front as well. Now, New York in here, where we saw Third Assault not only rescue and recover the guys in here who held out, but also has been expanded the front line. This is being shown by Noel reports as well, but he doesn't show the movement out to the west and that increase in movement that this map showed yesterday as well, at least not as clearly defined. But legends, that's all that I have for you today. I hope that you're having a fantastic... Oh, no, sorry, shit. I missed a piece. I'm actually seeing a lot online. I'm seeing like growing frustration from like Ukrainian bloggers and journalists, or like pro-Ukrainian bloggers and journalists in the West as well, with supporting nations. I'm seeing a lot of frustration grow, particularly towards then the US, when it comes to deliveries and aid and political statements as well. And I do wonder what this may actually look like and how far this will go for some people as far as disappointment there, if Ukraine is forced to sign some deal that may not be in their best interest or the promised goals of those 1991 borders, and what the fallout of that would be if it's directly seen that the US failed us, and that's the message that's being put out as well. How much like hate will there be that way? Again, I don't know. Legends, look after yourself, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.